and welcome back to SF Live. I'm Myrna Lim, your host. Tonight we have a very special guest. As you can see, the election season is here. In the next few months, the voters of San Francisco will be electing and choosing the key public officials who will be running the city. We will be choosing our next mayor. We will be choosing our next sheriff. And most importantly, we will be choosing our next district attorney. At this time, we have extremely qualified district attorneys, candidates. It's like the War of the Titans, but each one of them, as qualified as they are, and having possessed the good qualities a public official should be and should have, it's up to you, the voters, to decide which one of them will be your next district attorney. Tonight, I'm pleased to say that we have David Onek, a very qualified gentleman who has a long history in criminal justice in the legal system. He was a former police commissioner. First of all, he graduated from Stanford Law School, so pretty brainy, I must say. After graduating from Stanford Law School, instead of joining corporate America to make those, six-figure incomes, he decided to work pro bono for legal services in San Francisco. That's quite a feat. He has targeted a certain population to make amends with, to help. He has worked a lot with the juveniles within the juvenile system. He was a founder of the Berkeley Center for Criminal Justice. He also worked in the Office of Criminal Justice. He has authored several books and articles. And he's a family man, a father of 2 daughters. He's lived in San Francisco for 20 years in Bernal Heights. Welcome, David. How are you?
I'm terrific, Myrna. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So how are you holding up in this election?
Holding up great. We're running from one thing to another all the time, but I love it. I love the opportunity to really talk and interact with the voters of San Francisco about these issues that I've been working on for so many years here.
And how are your daughters holding up? Are they complaining yet?
There are some complaints. That's the hardest part, is having to spend some time away from them. But
Right.
every single minute I'm not on the campaign trail.
Right.
I'm with them, and that's what re-energizes
And how
me and
old are
keeps me
they?
going. They are 9 and 6.
Now those are formative years. So they say, Dad, how is your campaign going? Did they ask you that question?
Oh, yeah, and they're excited. They've come to different campaign events, and they like
Right.
to, be involved in the ways that they can be. So it's exciting for the whole family.
Okay, great. Now let's talk about you as a candidate. What is your defining characteristic? What defines you from DA George Gascon, with Bill Fazio, with Shamin Bach? What is it that the San Franciscans should see you as different from the others that will tell them, okay, this is my guy?
Sure. I'm someone who has seen this issue from all sides. I have very broad experience working with law enforcement, but very importantly, working with community and advocacy and criminal justice reform organizations for much of my career.
Mm-hmm.
We have a criminal justice system that's totally broken.
Right.
We have essentially practically bankrupt the state because we're spending so much on corrections. At the same time, 7 out of 10 people who come out of prison go back within 3 years.
Right.
So it's a total failure, and the Supreme Court has said it's unconstitutional. So we
Right.
need to absolutely dramatically overhaul our criminal justice system, and to do that you need someone who's been working to reform the system
Right.
from the outside for his whole career. So I've worked, you mentioned some of the places. I started at Walden House Adolescent Facility, counseling
Right.
delinquent kids,
Right.
later worked at Legal Services for Children, worked at the Haywood Burns Institute, which focuses on the overrepresentation of youth of color in the juvenile justice system and what we can do to make policies and practices fairer for all youth. and later worked for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. As you mentioned, I was on the police commission, so I have a lot of support from the law enforcement community. But really, when I went to Berkeley Law School to found the Berkeley Center for Criminal Justice, I brought it all together. What the Berkeley Center for Criminal Justice is about is bringing law enforcement and community together to build collaboration around pragmatic criminal justice reforms.
Right.
That is what I've been doing my whole career, and that's what this campaign is all about. So I think having someone who has the extensive, broad experience that I have is very, very unique. And I think at this point, with the kinds of reforms that we need in the criminal justice system, it's exactly what we need right now. So I'm really excited about it.
Right. Speaking of the overcrowding in the prison system, one can only describe it as a very, very complicated issue. I guess what's forthcoming that's going to be hitting the public, whether they like it or not, is the fact that Governor Jerry Brown said, look, I'm going to be realigning this whole prison system. And we're going to be sending back a lot of these prisoners that the state is now taking care of to the cities and the counties. So how would you process that? I mean, how many people are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So under what's called realignment, there will be about 30,000 prisoners coming back from the state level to the counties, and San Francisco is no exception, with an influx of prisoners coming in. It's actually starting October 1st, so it's right around the corner.
Okay.
Now, I'm a supporter of realignment in concept because I think it's much better to have people closer to home where they can be connected with their families and communities while they're locked up, or go directly back to their communities for low-level crimes.
Right.
The issue is that it costs money to do that correctly, and the state needs to make sure that it is sending money back to the counties along with these prisoners who are returning. They've promised some money for this year. I don't think it's enough, and there is no guarantee with the continuing budget crises we seem to have every year, that funding stream will continue. So one thing I'll fight very hard for is to make sure that we get streams of funding to fund both law enforcement. We need probation, and we need the sheriffs who run the jails to have more money, but we also very significantly need our community-based organizations to have more funding, because those are the groups that are working with people in the community to reintegrate them. I happen to have a lot of experience on the issue, particularly of getting jobs for people coming out of prison, and that is one of the number one things that we need to do to help people reintegrate.
Well, let's talk about some of the perhaps some of the key issues that affect the population, the prison population. One of the key laws that have been passed, I believe in 1994, is the 3 strikes law. 3 strikes and you're out, and that was triggered by the emotion that surrounded the kidnapping, the murder of Polly Klaas by this monstrosity of Richard Allen Davis, who, even when he was a boy, he was burning cats for fun. So I remember that time frame very distinctly, and I thought, 3 strikes, we should get these guys out, get him out of the street and put him where the sunshine will never see him again. But I guess what happened then would be, after that, the consequences have a lot more impact. But there's probably a lot of consequences that we did not want, or that the legislature did not anticipate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you characterized it very well. People back in 1994, I remember it very well. I fought very hard against 3 strikes, in vain. It passed overwhelmingly, because everybody believes that a small part of what 3 strikes was, which was, let's put serious and violent offenders, repeat murders and rapists away for long periods of time, up to including life in prison. Of course, I support that. Everybody supports that. The problem was the fine print. And the fine print showed the 3rd strike did not even have to be violent. And so we have a situation now where we have many, many people locked up in this state for very non-serious crimes for 25 years to life, which is not only completely unjust, but it's a complete waste of resources that could be going into things that actually make us safer. My good friend and colleague Michael Romano runs the Stanford 3 Strikes Clinic at my alma mater, Stanford Law School. They help get people out who have been in for 3 strikes, and some of the cases he tells me about are just heartbreaking. One of their clients stole a pair of socks and is now serving life in prison. Another had 0.1 grams of methamphetamine.
Right.
Life in prison. Another broke into a soup kitchen somewhere he ate twice a day. He broke in between meals because he was hungry.
Right.
The soup kitchen did not want to press charges, but charges were pressed, and
Right.
he's got a life sentence. Now, these punishment is needed in those cases,
Right.
but a life sentence is completely disproportionate to the crime. It's incredibly unjust, and it's an incredible waste of resources. So as District Attorney of San Francisco, I will only charge violent crimes as third strikes, and I will move. We need to go back to the ballot in 2012 to reform the Three Strikes Initiative. Because it was passed by initiative, the only way we can change it is going back to the voters,
see.
and I want to take a leadership role in going back to the voters and reforming three strikes. Last time there was an attempt to do that, I think there were only 1 or 2 DAs out of the 58 in the whole state who stood up and supported it. So guess what? It didn't get any traction. We need elected law enforcement leaders to stand up and say, this is the right thing to do for public safety. It's a poor use of
Right.
resources to put someone away for life for stealing a pair of socks.
Well, let me ask you something. Could judges affect the three strikes law? In other words, when they make decisions as with certain cases, do they create precedents? Like, for instance, trying to read, I was reading this case about this judge who decided, one of the similar cases you were talking about, not to sentence somebody on life, but rather sentence them on a much lesser charge. Do those create precedents that prosecutors or defense attorneys can then use to argue, barring another ballot initiative that hopefully
Yeah,
would
well-
reform it? But in the meantime,
Yeah, well, trial judges don't create precedent. They decide on the case that is before them, but the
Right.
judge ultimately decides. But the DA decides whether to even charge a three strikes. So
Exactly,
that is
right.
why the discretion of the DA is so key here. But it's funny you should mention judges, because there's a case recently where a retired judge who was very, quote, tough on crime,
Right.
this one three strikes case, after he retired, he couldn't stop thinking about how unjust it was. So he, the judge who put this guy away for life, reached out to the Stanford Clinic and
Oh,
said,
really?
when he read about them, and said, will you help me get this guy out of prison? And so that is, even the judges who seem most supportive of it at the time, as they begin to understand more what the implications of this law have been, are beginning to change their ways.
but
So
he was the one who sentenced
Yeah,
that person.
absolutely. And after retirement, instead of just relaxing in retirement, this was eating at him, eating
Yeah,
away
right,
at him.
right.
And he said, I need to do something about it. So he took action to try to get this one particular
but
person
in the
out.
meantime, as a district attorney, you can decide whether or not, say on a case, a burglar, you can decide to charge a lesser crime, a misdemeanor crime that will then not trigger.
Yeah, or you can decide not to count you can decide not to charge it as a strike. So
Right.
that's at your discretion.
Okay.
So it's strike eligible if it meets the criteria. But the whole thing about our criminal justice system is
Right.
it's local. We have discretion at the local level, which is why it's so important to have a district attorney who reflects San Francisco's values and who will use that discretion in a way that most San Franciscans would feel comfortable with.
Well, you had talked about your one of the projects you worked on as after law school would be diversity, or trying to look at certain demographics, look at certain races, nationalities who are more prone to be subject to getting arrested and so forth. I sat in some courts interning for some judges, and my first impression is like, wow, this courtroom is dark. And then what I meant by that would be there'll be a public defender, poor overworked public defender. She's got a cart full of cases that half of them she's never looked at, and then they bring on all these defendants, and then the judge will call a defendant and say, Mr. So-and-so, your attorney has been called to trial. Would you accept this counsel? And of course, she's not even opened the file at all. So typical defendant, I mean, if you're not into the system, you're not really aware of what's going on, you can just say, oh yeah, of course, judge. But how can you get due process when somebody has not even opened your folder, right? I mean, so as a district attorney, you would have some kind of impact in that process. How would you do that?
Well, you raise a bunch of different issues. One is just how overburdened the system is.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, a friend of mine, Amy Bach, just wrote a book called Ordinary Injustice about the ordinary
Right.
injustices that happen in the courtroom every day
Right.
around the country, which is really a very important book for people to read. But here we have an excellent public defender office, one of
Right.
the best in the country.
Yeah,
So
you have
people
to
are
say
getting excellent representation here. But the other issue you mentioned, which is that our system is overwhelmingly made up of people of color, and
Right.
that's just a fact in almost
Right.
any big city in the country. And that's something that I've really focused on much of my career, especially when I worked at the Haywood Burns Institute for
Right.
Juvenile Justice, Fairness, and Equity, which focused on reducing that overrepresentation
Right.
and making the system fairer. So there are things we can do in order to address that, but you have a situation where if you walk into almost any juvenile hall, if you walk into almost
Right.
any jail or any courtroom in urban areas in this city, everybody, almost all the defendants are people of color. And
Exactly.
there's something wrong there that we need to change. And a lot of it isn't overt racism anymore. There, of course, is some
Right.
remnants of that, but most of it is much subtler. There are race-neutral decisions that the system processes every day
Right.
that have a disparate impact on people of color for a variety of reasons. And what we need to do is look at those decisions, look at the data, break it down by race
Right.
and ethnicity, and try to see what policies and practices are leading to what outcomes that vary by race, and then seeing what we
Right.
can do to change those.
Well, here's my observation with our legal system. Okay, the California bar is one of the hardest bar, if not the hardest bar exam to pass. And I guess the reasoning behind that is that we already have too many lawyers. But the fact is, it's just like what you're saying. We have a lot of people who do not have access to the legal system because they simply can't afford it. So here you have a sea of lawyers, and there's not enough jobs for lawyers. But then you have all of these people, defendants, possible defendants, or victims, or whatever the case may be, but they do not have access to that legal expertise. Could you, as a district attorney, impact that, or how would you exercise whatever power you have to alleviate that?
Well, as a district attorney, I would certainly champion legal services. I
Right.
worked, as you mentioned, after law school, I worked at Legal Services for Children in San
Right.
Francisco. I got something called a Skadden Fellowship, which allows public interest attorneys to work in a public interest organization
Right.
for a couple of years with their salary paid by the Skadden Fellowship Foundation.
Right.
So I was very fortunate to do that, and want to encourage as many legal services organizations as possible to provide those kind of legal services.
Right.
Of course, the DA is prosecuting cases, so it wouldn't be our role to provide attorneys for people who need them.
Right.
But I would be that's the community that I come from, is the public interest legal community.
Right.
And so I would be very, very supportive of efforts for my colleagues, many of whom are running these organizations now, to see what the DA can do to help to draw attention to the very problem that you mentioned, which is
Right.
getting adequate representation for everyone. Again, we're very lucky in San Francisco because we do have a superb public defender's office, but for civil cases, and if there's a conflict and the public defender can't take your case, or in other places around the county, around the state, there are certainly problems with adequate representation.
Okay, if and when you become the district attorney, what's the first thing you'll do?
Well, on the very first day, I'm going to spend that day out in the community, because the community is going to be what's gotten me
Well,
elected.
first you're going to take care of your kids.
Yeah, I'll take my kids to school. That's the very first thing I'll do that
Your
morning.
wife.
Yeah.
You have to re-meet your wife.
We after November 8th, we're going to be spending some very quality time together.
good.
So we're looking forward to that.
Okay.
After I drop my kids at school that morning, which I will do to set the tone that as district attorney, I'm still going to be a dad first and foremost. I'm going to spend that day, of course, meet with my internal staff and all of that. I really want to make sure that everyone in the office is on board.
Right.
And so I'll meet with the entire staff. Once I've done that, I want to go out in the community, because really the most important thing we need to do is build trust with the community. That's the number one thing that can make
Right.
us safer, and it doesn't cost a thing. So it's really important in so many communities of color, low-income communities
Right.
in San Francisco. There's a very high degree of distrust of law enforcement.
Right.
And I think because I've worked in those communities for the last 20 years, because I have very prominent supporters from all of those communities, I think there's a degree of trust that starts out with me,
Right.
but I need to continue to earn that trust every
Yes,
single day.
speak-
So I'll be
speaking
out in
of
the
which-
community talking to people.
Speaking of which, I noticed your list of endorsements, and they're like the progressive sect. How did that happen? I mean, they're
Well-
great. I know a lot of these people. San Francisco is a small community.
Yeah, well, I'm very proud to have about 1,900 supporters
Amiano.
from all over the map.
John
Yeah.
Avalos.
Yeah, so I have Tom Amiano and John Avalos. Very proud to have both of their
Right.
endorsements. At the same time that I have John Avalos, Carmen Chu is also a supporter who's
Exactly.
kind of on the other end of the ideological spectrum
Right.
here. You know, I have the California Police Chiefs Association has endorsed me,
Okay.
and the San Francisco Teachers Union, United Educators of San Francisco, has endorsed me. So I have 6 of the 7 school board members, which if you go to a school board meeting, they often disagree on a lot of issues, but they all
Typical
agree
San Francisco.
to endorse me. So I think that I'm really pulling people in. I'm pulling in a lot of law enforcement support. I have actually over 30 members, current and former members of the San Francisco Police Department, have endorsed my campaign, including former Chief Heather Fong and former Chief Tony Rivera. Just today, Assistant Chief Jim Lynch emailed me to say, hey, I really want to support you, with a long email for all the reasons why. So I have a lot of law enforcement support. At the same time, I have pages and pages of support from people in community-based and advocacy organizations where I've worked my whole career.
Great.
So I think it's unique to bring all those people
I
together.
tell you, 22 minutes goes really fast, right?
It does. This has been great.
So, anyway, so we have about a minute and 30 seconds. What is it that you would like to communicate to the voters?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. We have a broken criminal justice system. We need fundamental reform, and in order to do that, we don't need someone who spent their entire life in law enforcement. That's important, and I've been on the police commission, I've been in the mayor's office of criminal justice, I have a lot of support in the law enforcement community, but what's more important is to have a very broad perspective.
Right.
Someone who has come up from community-based organizations, from advocacy organizations, from criminal justice reform organizations. I have
And
been
how can people contact you?
Sure. It's my website address is www.davidonek, DAVIDONEK.com. So come to my website. You can learn a ton more there, and
And they
hope
could call you devoted Chelsea, who's in the room right now.
my excellent campaign manager Chelsea is here indeed, and we are organizing volunteers left and right. So if you're interested, go to our website, contact us, and we'll get you involved. We're going to every neighborhood, door to door in the city.
Great. And great. Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure having you guys here, and I'm wishing you the best. And it's going to be a tough decision for the voters of San Francisco to make, as I would have the same difficulty. And anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and hope to see you again soon. And look for David and Chelsea out in the campaign trail and say hello. Thank you so much. Good night.